Stop the Week with Robert Robinson.
Hello, our conversation this evening comes from Sarah Harrison, the novelist, Edward Blishen, the author, Stephen Oliver, the composer, and Laurie Taylor, the professor. Music from Instant Sunshine. Well, there was a certain amount of incredulity in these premises when Michael O'Donnell referred to the Surrey Hills last week, as though he'd claimed there were saber-toothed tigers on the golf courses of Effingham. Well, David Howard of Wanham Way, Gomsall, if that is pronounced correctly, and of course it's in Surrey, thinks Laurie was particularly disrespectful about that range of jagged peaks which divides the lamasseries of Leatherhead from the Volvo hordes of Dorking, and he sends him these verses. They go as follows. Before the Romans came to Rye, or out to Severn strode, the sturdy Surrey yeomen stalked to the Surrey hills in woad. Their gentle hills and rolling hills on sandy headlands free, called Leith and Pitch and Winterfold and Iron Age Homebury. New Malden and East Molesey breed men who little know. The hamlets and the rivulets of Peaslake, Sheer and Hoe are Tillingbourne, which drove the mills that once did turn so free. In Albury and Abinger gives Gomsall cress for tea. You know where Cobbett rode his nag, you scoffing Ebor sage, where Bunyan found his hill and slough, and Evelyn filled each page. On lofty Leith Vaughan William sang, alone and quite unseen, O little town of Bethlehem, the dear old forest green. Thank God the men of Weybridge still know where to take the air. From Cold Harbour to Ewhurst they stride without a care. While Weybridge men wear barber coats, your Reigate man commutes, and Weybridge men make homemade wine from the grapes they buy at Boots. Well, I think that's rather charming, and I must say, if Chesterton were to overhear, Mr. Howard would have no cause to blush. Don't you think so?
I shall take a copy of Mr. Howard's poem with me for my next walk across the Yorkshire moors.
That's right. Well, now, on to this. Someone took exception, if you remember, to remarks made by the Duke of Edinburgh, and later on the Duke, or his gopher, said the remarks were only, quote, light-hearted. Well, I'm a bit leery of the word light-hearted. Never quite know what it means.
Now, I think that you could say that it was just simply meant vacuously cheery, but I think that you can really only understand it as part of a sort of special language which is used by people who write trails and promotions and blurbs and publicity handouts. It's a sort of part of a language of innocuity, and it goes along with words like in-depth and unpredictable and personal and not too serious and original. These are sort of like promissory notes by people who, by and large, haven't any clear idea of the contents to which they refer. Because you get these things, these words, like light-hearted, they occasionally slip into euphemisms, as when Stephen Oliver takes a fresh look at, means quite simply he's going to be dealing with a subject that's already been looked at twice by everybody else. And sometimes the relative meaninglessness of these phrases is dressed up by alliteration, as in Sarah Harrison discovers the delights of West Country amateur dramatics. And here and there it suggests that what we're about to hear may be snatched away forever, unless we're very quick. A last chance to hear Edward Blishen resolve his Oedipus crisis. But in all cases, I think these promissory notes are uncashable, because there's no fear of a comeback. No one can reasonably complain that Robert Robinson did not delve into the archives, and that Anne Leslie did not take us behind the scenes, or indeed that Milton Schulman was not really a special guest, any more than they could possibly claim that the conversation which is going to follow these brief observations of mine is not, and I quote from last year's Trail, irreverent.
Now, that's the worst word of all. I'll come to that in a minute. But yet, like, you can't imagine anyone telephoning the BBC after a programme saying, I don't think that was light-hearted. Because you're quite right about the promissory. If you said it was witty or amusing, then that is committing whoever's doing it actually to fulfilling a promise. But there's no promise in light-heart. It's also inviting the readers of the Radio Times or the listeners to the programme to conspire with those who are using this thing to bevel the edges, to blur the outlines.
I loathe the use, but it's very interesting that you never see the opposite use, heavy-hearted. We're going to see a very heavy-hearted drama. Why don't we have the opposite, you see? Because in fact, what I hate about the thing is that it nails you down before you begin. You've got to be light-hearted. So you sit gloomily in front of the set because you're not going to be light-hearted. And it's like all those phrases that try to be prescriptive for you. But they are only a particular range. And you don't have Hamlet at the National theatre a heavy-hearted drama, but it ought to be just as used, much
It
used.
is like equivalent to the smile on the face of someone who's already wanting you to laugh before
That's
the
right.
joke has been told, that kind of thing.
Yes, well, we none of us like to be told what to think, do we? And the trouble with some of these adjectives that are meant to whet our appetites is they do just about everything except, sit on our heads and punch us until we cry uncle. Things like side-splitting and heart-rending and show-stopping and thought-provoking. That brings a glaze to the eyes, doesn't it? They really make you go into your shell. And if there's one thing that really gets my goat when you're looking through the theatres trying to decide what you might go and see, is in capital letters, it is the happiest show in town, which brings on a wave of Scrooge-like misanthropy.
J.B. Priestley, I'm just reminded, took a scunner to the word disturbing, plays that were disturbing. He said the people who go to these plays are already disturbed out of their minds. They don't want any more.
I've been a victim of this myself, as Sarah says about the theatrical notices. Two shows that I had an interest in were one of which was described as brash, and the other as surely an adjective you never hear, rumbustious. Now, of all adjectives, the ones least likely to get me into any theatre would be brash and rumbustious. But I think I cut a pretty poor figure on this. After all, as Gilbert robustly said of Sullivan, he was the sort of man, concerning with the rash advertising of a Victorian theatre, he's the sort of man who sits on a fire and then complains that his bottom is burning. I think if you don't like the heat, you have to get out of the kitchen.
There's only one
really.
thing before all the letters pour, just to stave off the letters. Isn't it rumbustious rather than rumbustious? But you're only saying it that way.
I never had occasion to say the word before.
You were simply highlighting its inauthenticity in pronouncing it that way.
The truth is that all invitations to pleasure are disastrous, aren't they? I mean, I've always had this sneaking sympathy for those poets who undertake the description of the choice of Hercules, because between virtue and pleasure, which is the choice he has to make, virtue is always going to win, because all pleasure can say, well, you'll have a nice time, there'll be nice food, there'll be girls. Pleasure always behaves like those friends who drag you off to a party and say, well, it'll be nice when you get there. The point about pleasure is that it's an accident, not a substance. Passive enjoyment is the most difficult thing in the world to invite in anyone. Don Juan in Shaw's play has a remark which is wholly relevant to this. He says, to be in hell is to drift. But to be in heaven is to steer.
On the other hand, anybody who's had to categorize or characterize anything in the course of a review, say 200 words or so, has at some point or other reached that moment when the choice is between impossible words, unpretentious, which actually means dull. I mean, there's nothing there at all, or sane, which means that it only just avoids madness. Something like that. Well, that's what it appears to mean, but in fact, writing the review or whatever it is, you actually desperately, pathetically, wistfully try to hope that it has some meaning. I think we must have a little pity for those who produce these terrible words on our behalf, trying, as it were, to fly a flag above the entertainment.
Well, Beachcomber simply condensed it. All the reviews, he used to review mock novels, and his words were integrity, awareness, and a sense of value. And that sort of fitted everything.
Yes, but far worse than a review, where at least perhaps you can expand a bit and write a bit more, is when you, as I occasionally do, get sent these books where you just have to sort of give a quote that they can stamp on the back of the paperback. And then, of course, you do get trapped in things which you have read yourself on other books, and you know jolly well are publishing speak, but you get trapped into them. I mean, obviously, the good old couldn't put it down. They're paying me for this quote. Sweeping saga, couldn't pick it up. Glorious, bags of purple prose, and a compulsive page turner. The racy bits come at every 20-page intervals, And then of children's books, how I dread the enchanting. That means nauseating whimsy. Delightful, granny can read it aloud without blenching. And vintage, same old stuff.
A phrase which always strikes terror into my heart is the one which you see is another Radio Times one, which is continues his journey. It says something like Dick Sludge continues his journey around the slag heaps of the northwest. And you always think, you always seem to have missed the start of the journey. Even begins his journey, but continues. But I want just to take it back a little time bit to this word light, because the word light, we always said why, Edward was saying, why don't we have the word heavy-hearted? But, of course, this word light is a prefix which can be stuck around all over the place. I mean, there was a light programme which presumably aimed specifically to be light-hearted, and there is light music, which presumably aims for this impossible ground, which we've all said doesn't exist, which is something which
well, there are also light comedians, which means not very funny, and light meals, which means not much to eat.
Fancy being, though, something called head of light entertainment. It sounds as though you're not trying.
Interesting is one of those other words, and the Times has a little panel each week, if you've noticed, and they a list of books newly published, and they say, and it's headed "Some Interesting Books." Now, I know very well that they haven't got space to say exactly how or why they're interesting. They can't explain it. So therefore, why shouldn't they just say, here are some new books? I mean, obviously, they're not daft enough to pick the lousy ones. So you could say, here are some, because it's a very short step from saying some interesting books to saying some nice books.
The saddest story I know about the use of these words as kind of telegraphing a sort of generally accepted notion of what a book, say, is about. Here's a story told to me by someone for whom I'll invent a name, Bamber Gascoigne.
Oh, you vinegary old thing, you.
Impossible name. Anyway, but he had written a number of books which had all been discussed as coffee table books, and he felt this was unjust. But then on one occasion, he had one of his books discussed as though it were not a coffee table book. And so he read this excellent review, which ended with the final sentence, "This is a coffee table book." So he was grief-stricken. But then he received a phone call from the reviewer who said that he lived in Oxford or wherever it was, and always phoned in his reviews. And he hadn't actually said it was a coffee table book. He had said, "This is a covetable book."
as near as makes no matter.
Don't you think humour is terribly susceptible to all this stuff? Probably because it's the most subjective thing of all, and anything that we think is funny, somebody else will find as dull as ditchwater. But the lengths that people will go to try and define a kind of humour, special brand of humour, his special brand of humour, something he's peddling frantically like a sort of witch doctor around the country, uproarious and hilarious. But the one I really dread is gentle comedy, when you just know you're going to doze off. There's really a titter inside.
You've missed out zany humour, because they have to put in zany humour. Otherwise, you might not have known it was any sort of humour. You're sitting there with a face as long as a fiddle. I know exactly the man they're talking about when they say zany humour, but I'm too kind to mention
perfectly ordinary phrases in this context can become terrible. Even those two simple, usable words, has been, for example, as in Robert Robinson has been looking at the so-and-so retrospective. I just can't stand the has been looking.
I don't care for the taking a look. I mean, I can't quite envisage what people who are taking a look are actually doing.
Backwards
except peeping
glance.
round things, you know. Irreverent, though, you did mention. And that, it's borrowed from another age when the crazy gang was so carefully looking up at the royal family in the box and being so careful about pulling their legs a bit. And it's used, you can hear, it's pretty rare, but you can hear certain broadcasters using it today. I mean, knowing that they're using what they would describe as irreverent humour, as though George V was still on the
Cocking
on
a
the
snoot,
throne.
isn't it? Cocks a snoot.
It's cocking a snoot, that's right.
But again, Bob, speaking for those who have to produce these words, I thought the other day I saw a reference to a book being a triumphant performance. And I knew as a reviewer again that the triumph involved was the triumph of the reviewer in finishing the book.
The triumph of hope over experience, yes.
And then the word shrewd, which is very often shrewd, and serious.
What about quizzical?
Quizzical, yes, indeed. There's no word, in fact, that can't be used in these fashions.
All these words are, as it were, wagging the dog, aren't they? They are not thought. You know someone's borrowed it off a shelf and isn't thinking, because if you thought what you're writing, if you thought about it, if you're involved, you can use any of the words we've referred to and the reader won't even notice you.
And they're all words in which you can't say, this is how I feel. If you try to put them, if you say, I feel light-hearted, or I am being irreverent, it no longer works, because in fact they persist in being impersonal, and that is the point of them, because they are words which are put down, as Sarah suggests, like statements made about books, which in fact don't implicate the person who's made them.
I'll leave that to reverberate a little while we listen to an excellent song called Don't Mention Money.
I needed a bank loan to cover my debt. The manager saw me and smiled when we met. We talked of the weather and the state of my health. He spoke of the city and the national wealth. He talked of my mortgage and how rates may fall, but straight hard cash were not mentioned at all. My overdraft's not mentioned when we meet. My manager's very discreet. Don't mention money, don't talk cash. Don't mention money, it's brassy, it's brash. Where there's muck, there's brass. Where there's clouds, there's rain. Don't mention money, it's bound to cause pain. I met a car salesman at our local bar. He was so charming, he sold me a car. He spoke about tappets, magnetos and coils, distributor failure and multi-grade oil. He spoke of a test drive if I happened to call, but he didn't talk prices or money at all. A salesman, when trying to sell a car, knows when he's going too far. Don't mention money, don't talk cash. Don't mention money, it's brassy, it's brash. Where there's muck, there's brass. Where there's clouds, there's rain. Don't mention money, it's bound to cause pain. I caught a burglar burgling my flat. On the way to the station, we had quite a chat. He spoke about jemmies and fences and swag. He told me of porridge and how the wheat dragged. He spoke of the jewels and antiques he'd grabbed, and yet did not mention the money he'd bagged. All burglars are taught in their youth to talk about cash is uncouth. Don't mention money, don't talk cash. Don't mention money, it's brassy, it's brash. Where there's muck, there's brass. Where there's clouds, there's rain. Don't mention money, it's bound to cause pain. Don't mention money, it's bound to cause pain.
That was a country and western piece from the Surrey Hills by our clean-shaven friends. Instant Sunshine, but of course they get us straight to the heart of the matter. Budget week, and a smell of money mingles with the scent of crocuses. I'm sick of love, I'm even tired of rhyme, but money gives me pleasure all the time. Yes, along with sex, the ever-interesting topic, and like sex again, okay to discuss in general terms, but somehow not quite nice to get too personal about. So here we go. Why is it rude to talk about money?
I think the English are very naturally and properly reticent about money because they instinctively realise that it has absolutely nothing to do with the value of the work provided. It's no coincidence that in English we use the word fortune to mean wealth, but also good luck. It's good luck. One is a plain fish and therefore marketable. And any freelance recognises, as Mozart did in the 18th century...
And he's just any freelance after all. Look at it as you will. Oh, yeah. Drop of freelance is
we're all
name.
scrabbling on the foothills somewhere, Bob. Give us a break.
I just
Heavens,
just helping you along.
A cat may look at a king, I presume.
Oh, I didn't intend you to smart.
That was a really mother-of-pearl dagger slipped between the third and fourth rib, was.
Get on with it, Stephen, because I'm well aware you hadn't finished.
Freelance knows
the death of Banco.
Don't
horrible shadow, unreal
don't do it.
shadow heads. You get grotesquely overpaid for one job and grotesquely underpaid for another. And the entirely arbitrary nature of payment in the freelance world indicates that wealth or has no relation at all to value. Mozart wrote on a receipt for some German dances, he said, "Too much for what I have done, but too little for what I could do."
Yeah.
As a freelancer, I don't recognise at all what Stephen was talking about, actually.
Clear as crystal.
What I think is interesting is I think Richard Aldington, long ago in a novel called Death of a Hero, said how strange it was that literature had never got round to recognising that a condition of a man's behaviour is the amount of money he knows he's got in his pocket, the amount of money he knows he's got in the bank, and so on. So in a sense, you would expect that at some point somebody would have come along and said, well, he walked out that morning, he was clean-shaven, he was in love with somebody or other, he had £35 in his pocket and something in his wallet and something in his bank. Because all these things are conditions of what he is. But why...
But are you saying it's a determining factor? Are you even going further and saying it's the basic determining factor of how a man behaves? Money.
We're all aware, aren't we, of how much money we have, and yet it is a great secret even from ourselves. We don't actually like to think of our daily lives as being conditioned by it, but it is. We actually do have regard to the amount of money in our pockets and in our bank and so on when we actually proceed on our daily behaviour. But this is something we don't actually register. We actually don't register because we register the obvious things. But it doesn't seem to me there's any very good explanation of this because we've been going so long. You would have thought we'd have found some way of converting money into romance of some kind or other. But have we done so?
Well, if you're saying money is convertible into behaviour, you've said it, really.
Well, a lot of the talk about money and about the fact that we don't know how much money other people have got or how they manage their money is like not knowing what their morals are. Because we feel that there is this part of their life which is kept away from us. And when we suddenly find out how much they have got, how much they have saved, or how much they have accumulated, then we suddenly feel that we have a particular insight into their personality, which is not given to us by knowing the clothes they wear, the nature of their husband or wife, or their musical interests. That knowing how they are in relation to money is a particular guide, because we also believe that accumulating money is a sign of an impoverished human nature. And that if we can catch someone out who has been accumulating money, who has not been allowing that they've been doing that, that is to discover much more than the secrets of their sex life. That is to discover that they've been concealing from us a vice which we believe is intimately connected with something to do with the failure of their personality, their lives. And when someone like Maynard Keynes comes along and talks about, as he did towards the end of his life, about the idea that it would be only, he talked about the way in which we could reach a state where everybody agreed that the love of money was detestable and that there was a disgusting morbidity to love money. And he described it as one of those semi-criminal, semi-pathological propensities which one hands over with a shudder to the specialists in mental disease. Now, that was a person who spent a great deal of his time
lying in bed, investing in the stock market.
A great deal of his time investing in the stock market. But nevertheless, he did thoroughly, in those long things that he wrote towards the end of his life, thoroughly recognise the connection, the tight connection between looking after money and morality.
Yeah, you see, I do believe there's a more scientific word for it than detestable. I think people who are interested in money is really, after all, only a conduit or a channel or an instrument for putting you in touch with the way you might survive. It's when the money becomes an end in itself that it becomes a kind of cul-de-sac. It gets in the way. It stands there like a heap of ordure. Stephen will remember.
Dustman is clearly rearing his ugly head at this stage.
Mr. Boffin, golden-hearted as well as the golden dustman, had in his backyard, as you remember and I remember, this pile of ordure, which of course, gave him nothing but alienation, made him suspect what was around him, because the money had become the end, as though the money were a subject. Once money becomes a subject rather than the means to something else, it becomes a mere possession. And as we all know, there is no power in mere possessions.
I think that anyone who's read Our Mutual Friend must feel, in parallel with that the degeneration of Mr. Boffin's character is wonderfully and acutely observed and wholly realistic. And the fact that the idea that it's all been a put-on job is wholly unsatisfactory at the end. You never believe that at all. But I think the answer to Milton Keynes... Milton Keynes.
Yes, he used to live there, had the biggest house, very grand
Phyllis
apartment.
Keynes, whatever the man's name was, the view that the love of money is a degenerate is simply that in widowers' houses, where someone says, the love of money is the root of all evil, and the rent collector says, yes, and we'd all like to have the tree growing in our garden.
But it seems to be the most obvious thing that money, that to be excessively interested in money is an undesirable, disagreeable, and in the end, for the person concerned, disastrous thing. But what is interesting is that lots of people who are not really like that, who are not greedy and not obsessed with money, nevertheless, who are open and frank in all other matters, remain extremely coy about money.
As they
Remain
do
secret.
about their private sex lives,
Well,
I
exactly.
imagine.
But why is that? Because I have sex. Well, I suppose.
Well,
it's very difficult.
one answer is because we all suspect anyone who tells you anything to his credit in sexual terms or in financial terms. We have all been taught to assume that he's fibbing.
Apropos of what you're saying, there's an astonishing number of sort of euphemisms which people use to disguise the fact that they've done pretty well and hoarded it. You know, we
That's right.
live quite well, we're nicely placed, we're quite comfortable, we enjoy a very good life, they say. Just to give the impression, you know, they just have enough on their board, they're quite happy with just enough, they're satisfied with what they can get, that they haven't been, there's none left over lying around in a nasty, sort of unseemly heap. And I was astonished recently by somebody who came up to me at a social gathering and suddenly announced, somebody that I know quite well, younger than me, and said, oh, he was rapidly approaching the time when he wouldn't have to work again. And he announced this, and I was quite shocked to the core. Not simply because of this information, but because he'd actually had the audacity to say it to me. He'd handed me this conversational hot potato with, I just didn't know what to do with it. Because in most social gatherings, particularly where people don't know each other all that well, there's a kind of, you know, a gentle, civilized but ineluctable current which is trying to establish a baseline about what people are worth. And what you're really trying to find out is who is worth the
What a
least.
church
Because
mouse you make me feel,
because then, hang on, no, please, because what you're trying to find out is who is worth the least, because then you know exactly that you mustn't trump them, you know that you mustn't say that something is fantastically good value that they're going to think is terribly expensive. Everybody can relax a bit and do the decent thing. And it's
Is
shocking to
this
hear somebody-
East Molesey or Letchworth or possibly both? I'd just like to know.
And
One
that's
has to
what
be
you see,
careful.
but it is the very fine distinctions that you're making are all within the middle ground, because oddly enough, if you look at the extremes, then as we've seen recently, top businessmen and people like that are always wearing their salary like a badge of office. They are not the least bit concerned about allowing everybody to know that they earns £1 million a year. The other end of the middle ground that you're talking about is in fact that we have access to the wages, in fact, of people who earn considerably less than that, who, if you like, are at the bottom of the wages scale, because they are regularly and routinely paraded during strikes in which people say, well, these people are earning £150 a week, or they're earning £200 a week, they're asking for another £15 a week. Now, it is in this middle ground that you're describing that secrecy occurs, because at one end, these people are happy to expose it, at the other end, it is exposed for them.
Laurie,
There is
Well, the
something
thing
much
is, if
more
they
subtle
do
than
this,
powerful.
you see, which, I mean, you probably meet these people. I don't. All I do is look in the newspaper, and it seems that the writer of the article is saying what the man earns. But what I'm getting at is, if anyone says, you know, I earn £1 million a year, what he's doing is pulling rank, more or less what you're saying that they do. Now, we all pull rank one way or another, or hope to. Let's say we flatter ourselves on being clever at French or mental arithmetic. What we're doing is brandishing our cleverness. But why it's fairly all right to do that is that our cleverness is not a quantifiable item. It's something that can always be sort of put down by someone who's cleverer at mental arithmetic. Where these people who actually brandish how much money they have, and I think they always choose their company fairly carefully, they will always win. It's a kind of arms down in which they'll always win. They pull rank. It makes it not very interesting.
But I think Laurie is wrong about the notion that at the very bottom nobody cares. Because I remember we were very poor, and my father's great statement used to be, if we do this or that, we should look as though we haven't got two halfpennies to rub together. And in fact, it was all right for people to assume that we had two halfpennies, but it wasn't all right for people to assume that we had anything else, actually. That was the real problem.
Really?
And it
Really?
still seems to me it suddenly seems to me that, in fact, the point about in a society like ours, we are enormously vulnerable in respect of money, because, in fact, a great deal of status in a society like ours, which is money-obsessed, a great deal of human status depends upon income. It is really much more than sex, a demonstration of your virility or not, your power. So, in fact, when what you're concealing is something you might very well be willing to admit that you're sexually impotent, but you might be terribly unwilling to admit in a society like ours that in fact you don't earn as much
But
as you
Edward,
ought.
What breaks this silence? I mean, occasionally this silence is broken because there are people who walk around, and it's interesting that when they walk around with cash, with wads of pound notes. And these are people who say that they will have nothing of the credit economy, they will have nothing of the secret bank accounts, that in fact they are, and as they bring those notes out of the pocket, always bent in half, and there are £20 notes. There are notes of a currency, the colour of which probably those sitting around the table here with our credit cards intact in our wallets would find it difficult to guess. And they peel has to be the word, a note is peeled off, and it is held up and it's waved around so that drinks around the bar, whoever you are, the note touches you almost as the drink is ushered in on your behalf. Now that assertiveness, from, if you like, from bookmakers, from people perhaps, or whatever, that is like an act of defiance in the face of the middle-class secrecy.
Well, I don't know. Well, I mean, you remind me of a friend of ours, indeed that friend who lives, within striking distance of Hampton Court, and he said, he uses the phrase, some people are funny about money, and I egged him on a bit, and he told me, he said, well, I'm a bit funny about money too. It usually means mean. It usually means near. Yeah. But he said, I'm a bit funny. In my case, he said, I do have pound notes, £5 notes, £10 notes. He said, but I hide them in books.
I remember our English master, Spencer Vaughan Thomas, Winfred Vaughan Thomas's brother, full of words. But I remember him saying to us, I have no desire to earn £1,000 a year, which was a noble statement in about 1936. You remember when £1,000 a year...
Indeed, I do.
What do you find specifically noble, Edward, about a man saying, I don't want to earn £1,000 a year?
No,
it doesn't seem to me... It seems to me wholly amoral. I'm not saying it's a bad thing to say, but it doesn't seem to me to be a...
No, it
was a noble statement in those days.
It seems to me a statement wholly apart from...
Nobody is going to get marks for patting themselves on the back in
for
this
being
way.
Poor.
No, but do you remember? Well, you're only just starting. You're a slip of a lad yourself, but I'm not. And when I started out, I didn't care a hoot about money. I hadn't the slightest thought.
But you didn't say that you didn't care.
I sought to define myself by all sorts of other activities. It's later in life that the money might seem to start building up. And you've got to bear in mind, the disease or the plague may have struck you if you turn first to the financial pages in the newspaper. But at the beginning, nobody, I would expect, wanted money, and this man that Edward's talking about was merely saying it. However, yes, you're right.
I would like to put in another plea for one piece of hypocrisy in this sea of hypocrisy which surrounds income and money in this country. That is to revive seriously that Monty Python suggestion ages ago that when people are talking about how much other people earn and whether they should be on strike, that in fact on the television an interviewer who says, well, are you really asking for more money, that the amount of his salary should appear above his head as he asks the question, and simultaneously the salary of the person who's being asked the question.
I think that's jejune, honestly, Laurie, because the man, if he's doing it properly, isn't asking the question on his own behalf. He's asking it because it's there to be asked.
If Jeff Blunt writes in the Standard, it's about time the working class tightened their belts, the addition of the phrase £600 for 1,000 words after his name makes more difference to the argument than any single
that name, Jeff Blunt, I believe you just made it up. But there is one consolation. I mean, we've spoken of the random distribution of money, and there is one consolation about it. At least we know those who got it don't deserve it.
Sarah Harrison, Stephen Oliver, Edward Blishen and Professor Laurie Taylor were stopping the week with Robert Robinson. Instant Sunshine provided the musical interlude, and the programme was produced by Michael Ember.